Hey, everybody. It's Monday night, and I got a special thing for you to do. So, if you're tuning in and listening now carefully, we're going to have some surprise here. Disputed Lands Monday night. If it works. Here we go. And you guys aren't seeing it. It's not working, Doug. Oh, well.
Oh, well, you had a plan. Everyone has a
it.
plan, so they get hit in the middle right in the middle of the face.
I had a plan, and it's just not working. But that's okay. I have an intro that I'm trying to figure out why in the world it's not connecting here. I'm just going to have to talk to the people who know better. I have an intro and an outro. Jake Grant put it together for me from over here on IUC TV. And I'm just not technical savvy enough. I got it all loaded up. I thought I did everything right. Anyway, we're here with my guest again tonight, Doug Woodward, in our third installment, talking about his book. Give the name of the title book of the book, Doug.
Rebooting the Bible,
and the full title.
Oh yeah, let me get it out.
Yeah, it's so long, folks. It's so long that even he doesn't remember the full title.
Yeah, well, I have to. Part of it is because I changed the subtitle several times. So I had to do that. So the subtitle. This is what the book looks like, and then the subtitle is Part 1. This is Part 1, right? Part 1 is exposing the second century conspiracy to corrupt the scripture and alter biblical chronology. All right. And then Part 2, which I hope to have done by the end of the summer, will be addressing sort of the reconciliation or reconciling primeval. That's really old. Biblical history with archaeology and alternate history. All right. So it's going to be in two parts. This guy is merely 150,000 words and 450 pages, and that's Part 1. So it's, it's meant to cover a very tough subject, but to do it so that it's accessible, readable, hopefully enjoyable, and yet you're going to learn a ton when you go through it.
What I love about this is that, first of all, I know, number one, you've been hanging around with Doug Krieger for a title that long, and two, I don't have to catch any flack for the length of my subtitle for my book anymore for its length, because you've blown it out of the water by a couple paragraphs.
Oh yeah, well, Tom Horn, his subtitles are basically kind of like the whole back section of what's on the back of the book, but
that's fine. So tonight we're not going to rehash 1 and 2. You can go back and do those. For the person who commented about saying that because we gave honor to the Talmud, we've lost all credibility in your sight, go back, please, and listen to what was said. Our Constitution for the United States used information that can be found in the Talmud. It was taken much of the foundation, which you can already find in the scripture. No different than what you already find in the scripture. It's just acknowledging what the forefathers looked at. No different than what you find in the scriptures, folks. I don't know how to say it any more clearly than that. I get frustrated with this, Doug, because I admonish people to listen carefully, understand what they're hearing, and yet they still go off half-cocked. And sometimes I get passionate. I don't get angry very often, but I do get angry when words are spoken clearly. We've asked people to listen clearly, and yet they still want to take it out of context and hear only what they want to hear. It's like, folks, pull your heads out of the sand, please. Pull the earplugs out of your ears. And I'm sorry if this is offending you, but those kind of things are offensive when somebody has spent so much time and effort choosing carefully the words they use to express to you factual information. I mean, you want to get upset about it. We're just telling you what the forefathers used as a resource.
Yep.
I don't get how you want to be upset at us and how we've lost credibility in your sight because we're telling you what the facts are. I mean,
part of your frustration, and it's my frustration, is is that people, when it comes to religion and politics, two topics you have to be careful when you talk about.
Yeah.
That everyone is, as soon as you say something that conflicts with their basic point of view, or they think it conflicts with their basic point of view, the walls go up, unlike what Trump does. The walls go up, and people immediately are in a reject mode.
Yeah, one of our viewers here says, "Hey, Chad, let me just get on there and show you how to run your show." That's tongue in cheek. Bowman, he's a good friend of mine. But yeah, it's just sometimes, it should be legal to just grab somebody by the collar and slap them just once or twice lightly to get their attention before you speak.
Right.
I love them. I do love them because I've been there. I've been on that side where I heard totally incorrectly what was said, and probably more than once before, the dichotomy or the brainwashing I was under, could be removed.
Well,
and I understand it, but it's just like,
here we go. But here we go. Here's my summary: is that we should walk through the narrow gate, but we shouldn't walk through it with a narrow mind.
There you go. All right, tonight's show, we're picking up. We're in chapter 5 of the book. If you've already got the book, bless you. This is chapter 5. We're going to talking about chronology, and we're going to talk about, first, we're going to let Doug expound upon the sources, the vorlog of texts that were used when the chronologies for the scriptures were used, principally out of chapters 5 and 11 of Genesis, is where these are laid out with dates. They're found later quoted in the scriptures, those genealogies, also in Matthew, but you're not given the dates in those later scriptures. If you want to find the dates to calculate, you've got to use Genesis 5 and 11. Doug, from there, go ahead and tell us what were the vorlog that were used in this.
All right. Well, all right. So the vorlog is a VORLAGE is a term that means sort of the original from which copies are made. All right. And as we've covered in the past, there really are two vorlogs, to keep it simple. There is one that was used for the Hebrew vorlog that was used for the Septuagint. I need to change my little screensaver so it doesn't come on so quickly. That was used for the Septuagint. That vorlog was probably within 200 years of the compilation of the scripture in Jerusalem, which was around 450 BC. And so the translation into Greek in Alexandria was only about 170 years later. All right, so we know Ezra and Nehemiah were the guys that were back from the captivity, and they were instrumental in this process. Now, what we also know, though, and we know this through the Dead Sea Scrolls, is that there was a different vorlog that was more or less manufactured by the rabbis that were formerly Pharisees, not parasites, but Pharisees.
Well, sometimes
might have been parasites, but we don't want to call them that. That they reconstructed a Hebrew vorlog that they tampered with, and they did this at the end of the first century, within 30 to 40 years of the destruction of the temple. The mastermind was a guy named Rabbi Akiva, and he was also kind of key to the whole story of Bar Kokhba, the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and so forth. All right, so the first thing is that we have these two vorlogs. One is very close to the original. That was the one that was used in the translation to the Greek, to the Septuagint, which was begun around 280. Most of the Old Testament Hebrew books were completed within 50 to 75 years. There were other books like Maccabees, 1st, 2nd, 3rd Maccabees, that were probably not completed until around 140, 130 BC. All right, so that's vorlog 1. Vorlog 2 were Hebrew text manuscripts that were assembled by Akiba in his academies. They were tampered with, and one of the things that we'll talk about tonight, the specific thing we'll talk about tonight, is the chronologies of Genesis, and this is where they made some dramatic changes, in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11. Both of them are genealogies, and both of them also provide chronologies. Most Bible genealogies do not provide a chronology. These are the two that are the exceptions. Genesis 5 takes us basically from Adam to Noah, and Genesis 11 takes us essentially from Noah to Abraham. All right, and so those are the sort of the two vorlogs and the two chronologies. Now, there are sources that are ancient sources that can tell us which chronology was the most accurate. There's a chronology in each of the vorlogs. There's a chronology in the Septuagint that we believe is the accurate one, that tells us that the creation of Adam and Eve, if you believe in a historical Adam and Eve, and I do, that they were created approximately 5,500 to 5,800 BC. The vorlog that was used by Akiba, and what we could call then the Proto-Masoretic text, eventually becomes the Masoretic text. It indicates that the Adam and Eve creation occurred in 4,000 BC. So you have a discrepancy of about 1,600 years. All right.
Right.
So
and
chapter 5 is going to now really drill into the differences between those, why there's differences, and what's the evidence for which one's the more authentic. And then it's going to jump into the section or the question of, is it legitimate in Bible, in interpreting the Bible, to believe that they're called together the chronogenealogies, whether or not they actually provide a true historical date for when these patriarchs lived and when Adam and Eve were created. And so is that really their purpose, or is that our modern day misunderstanding? And so that's what chapter 5 is really about.
Yeah, and I want to point out for folks that Doug provides several charts. I don't have them for display here tonight onto the show, but he has for you several charts in an Excel format. You can they're taken straight from an Excel form. It's very easy to read.
Tell I was a CFO at one time.
Yeah, you can tell that financial officer. The Excel spreadsheets are like third hand. He lays out for you both from the LXX and the MS those texts. He lays them out, their years and their calculations, their dates, so you can sit there and see the math yourself. Now, the second part I want to add to this, which I'm sure Doug is going to get to, is when we start talking about, okay, so we have two different texts, and as we discussed previously, the primary reasons that Doug has pointed out is there's two principal reasons for this. One being, the first one is to hide the Messiah, but the second one, this one that we're focusing on now, is related to that, in that the Messiah was forecasted by anybody who could do math, by anybody who could do calculations, to arrive on a certain date. And of course, if the genealogies, which are so clearly laid out and easily calculable for anybody who is, taught in the mathematics, could have calculated the day of the Messiah. So they had to both hide the Messiah in the words that were used, but they also had to hide the Messiah in the math. And the only way to hide him in the math is to mess with the genealogies as they're laid out. Mm-hmm. So that's a summary of what he's saying here. Two texts, one believed to be the most accurate, the LXX, and the other one being the MS, or the Proto-Masoretic MT, all that, or PMT, which predated
Proto-Masoretic, yeah. Proto just means before, sort of before the matter. Right. Yeah,
that were used to do this, which was the Akiba's line. Now, anybody who does genealogies, when they come to and arrive at these conclusions, one of the easiest ways to try to calculate is to calculate from what is known and then work your way backwards, which is how many of folks who like to study the Bible calculations will begin with. It's the most simple. It's the easiest. Start with what is known and then work your way backwards. and go from there, which you can do up until about the time of the Exodus, or you can get to the Second Temple. But after that, and to the time of the Exodus, that's when things start getting a little funky.
It gets very funny.
It gets very funny because of the archaeology, which is what you're going to get into. But I'm getting ahead of you, so
yeah.
Pick up from there. So there's several ways to calculate the timeline. So,
right. Now what we're gonna deal with first are these chronologies that are the most ancient chronologies that are in Genesis.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, as you were mentioning, and as we'll get into in chapter 6 and 7 of the book, I will walk you through from the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, which is 586 BC. That's a date that virtually everyone agrees with, whether they're a Christian theologian, scholar, or whether they're a secular scholar. Virtually everyone agrees with that date, 586 BC. But how long were the kingdoms and the kings of Israel? How long did they reign? Roughly, they reigned 400 to 500 years. But the preciseness of that, the Bible does give it to you, but it's not easy. You have to work at it. All right, so there's about a 500-year period there. Then there's the period of the judges. That is roughly about a 400 to 500, maybe actually 600-year period as well, right? That is very difficult to get at, but I think I've done it through the help of a lot of different sources, all right? So there's that sort of middle period, which is the kingdoms of Israel and the judges. Now, that's fuzzy. Once you get, however, to Abraham, and you go from Abraham to Noah, and then from Noah, you go to Adam, Genesis 5 and Genesis 11 are very specific as to how many years elapsed. All right. Now we're going to focus on those tonight. All right. So the chronology, the Usher King James Version chronology says that from Jesus going back to Adam was roughly 4,000 years. The Septuagint, and as I'll show you, other sources, ancient sources, suggest no, it was longer. It was about 1,600 years longer. It was from Jesus to Adam was about 5,600 years. So that means that, for instance, the Jewish date today, 5778, it's actually off by over, we'll just say 1,600 years, but there's a little bit more to it than that.
Right.
But roughly, instead of being 5778, it's closer to 7,500. Right now, that's going to mess with prophecy folks that want to say, well, there's 6,000 years from Adam, to today, which is like our good brother Doug Krieger. That's his argument, and that's very common. And then they say, then the final 1,000 years will be the millennium. Well, as it turns out, one of the reasons why the rabbis were messing with the chronologies of Genesis is they held a similar belief. They believed the Messiah was going to come between the 5,000th and the 6,000th year. All right, so they believed kind of the same thing, but what was going on there was that they were saying, well, okay, Jesus of Nazareth, he looks like he could be the Messiah. We need to disprove that he's the Messiah. So one of the things we're going to do, besides the fact we're going to alter a bunch of the messianic prophecies, which they did, and that's talked about kind of in the first 4 chapters of the book, are the messianic prophecies that they altered. All right, but then they also altered these chronologies in Genesis. And what they were trying to do was they were trying to take time out of that 5,000 to 6,000 year window. They wanted to bring it down to that 4,000 year window. And why did they want to do that? Because by doing that, they could then say, see there, Jesus couldn't be the Messiah because the time is not right yet. It's going to still be another 1,500 years before before the Messiah could come. Well, that's interesting. But we know that there's a problem because the church fathers, starting off with Justin Martyr and then many of the church fathers said, wait a second, you're cheating. What you've done is you've gone in and you've changed the chronologies. What you started doing, and you did this from Adam to Noah by taking out 600 years. You took out 100 years out of 6 different generations. And then we're going to go into from Noah or Shem to Abraham. and you took out another 700 years, another 7 generations, which you took out either 100 years or you took out 50 years. Generally speaking, it's 100 years in about a dozen instances. Then there are a few other little mistakes. Oh, there you go. There are a few other mistakes. You can see the variance there on the right. So if everyone's seeing that. So that's kind of what I'm talking about. These are the kinds of changes that they were making. And so you can see the variances there between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint. All right. And so when you get down to the bottom line, you're going to see about 1,386 years there on that. And yeah, 1386. Now, where's the other that I'm talking about? The other that I'm talking about is essentially what's known as the Seder Olam Rabbah, which was the calendar, the Jewish calendar that was assembled around 150, 160 AD by one of Rabbi Akiba's aficionados.
I'm looking.
Right? Yeah, that's the Seder Olam Rabbah. That's later. And they did that not only to kind of say the same thing about the Genesis 5 and 11, but also to mess with Daniel's chronology of the 70 weeks of years. All right, so this is talked about wonderfully well by the late J.R. Church in his book, Daniel Reveals the Bloodline of the Antichrist. And it's been demonstrated by others. Even non-Christian Jewish scholars agree that what happened was that it appears, in fact, I actually quote a Jewish scholar that says, for some strange reason, our holy sages, the rabbis, decided to take out several hundred years from this period of time. We can't imagine why. It must have been, this is a Jewish scholar saying, it must have been that God told them that they should do that.
Yeah.
They had a word of knowledge. And God told them to change his word.
Right.
Daniel got it wrong or something like that. All right, so when you add those two things together, that's where you get these differences in years. And so now what ultimately, I'll just kind of make this statement, then we'll go back and pick up some more of the detail. Ultimately, what I do for the reader, and I'm not the first to do this, but what I do for the reader is I take the reader and I give you really the chronology, I work out the chronologies all the way from Jesus all the way back to Adam. All right, and there are sticking points, as I said, with the kings of Israel and the judges of Israel. But I walk you through those very carefully in chapters 6 and 7 of the book. And I also deal, of course, there. I'm also trying to point out to you precisely when the Exodus occurred and when the conquest of Canaan occurred. Because this is, in terms of apologetics, in terms of defending the scripture, this is one of the hottest subjects. I can't remember, Chad, had you seen Patterns in Genesis?
I have actually watched that. And if for those who are not familiar with the Patterns in Genesis that was done, in his interviews, go back. I encourage you to listen to that. I think even
it's Timothy Mahoney, by the way.
Timothy Mahoney, Derek Gilbert did several VFTs, View from the Bunkers, VFTBs, interviews with him on this.
Oh, that's great. I didn't know that.
Where he talks about his frustrations that he had in the datings of the Exodus with the archaeological findings. Now,
right.
What he also came up with discrepancies in the dating, but what he ended up doing, I think, was adjusting his timeline to meet the archaeological evidence. But there was a certain amount of frustration that he suffered because of this, and you can tell it kind of left a bad taste in his mouth,
right,
because of that. So what Mr.
Woodward, by the way, I'll just say, I go into that issue with him and with David Roll, who is his Egyptologist friend and expert. I go into that in great detail in chapters 6 and 7, and I point out exactly what you're talking about, and I point out kind of what their evidence was telling them, and then I point out why they backed off of the evidence. And primarily, it was because conservatives did not want to hear an answer different than 14,040 BC for the Exodus.
Exactly.
And yours truly is too stupid to worry about that. So I point out, I'll just throw the date out. I point out the date is 1628 BC, which is right in the window that Tim Mahoney and David Roll talk about, but they won't go there. And it's because they got too much criticism from fundamentalists that already didn't want to believe in the Septuagint. They want to protect the King James Version. All right. So, and they do that for reasons which we've talked a bit about, but we'll talk about more probably sometime. But anyway, yes, the main point though is that they provide great evidence that backs up what I'm saying, but they miss a few things, and I try to point out where they cheat, where they fall short, and I go into that in considerable detail. So long and short of it is that they confirm what I'm saying. They just back off of a couple of points that would have put us really right exactly on the same point.
Right. And so anyway, bottom line is there's discrepancies that caused a bad taste because people could not accept the evidence of archaeology. Instead, they wanted to hold true. And you talk about the difference between these being traditional, what would be known as traditional evangelicals versus what was the other word you used? Versus liberal evangelicals. I think.
Yeah, there's more. There's sort of I would say fundamentalist evangelicals.
That's the other.
Which I would classify those that hold to the King James only, and the Usher dating. I would hold them to be fundamentalists. They're still good brothers and sisters. They would not necessarily think we're necessarily good brothers and sisters, but I would think they are. Right? And there are what I would call mainstream evangelicals, which tend to believe in historical Adam and Eve, but they believe that the Bible is infallible and inerrant, but they don't necessarily hold that the King James is the only Bible version that is inerrant. And then there are the more progressive or liberal evangelicals. I would hold a Dr. Heiser in that category, and really quite a number of others, Hugh Ross, John Walton, others that I would say they're evangelicals, but their interpretation of Genesis is more metaphorical, not as historical. All right.
Yeah, and which I am not one. I am probably more like you. Which is why I think this is for me easier for me to grasp, perhaps because it already is closer to the paradigm I already hold. But is that it's a literal truth. It says what it means. It means what it says.
It is.
You
true.
Don't have to read into it. You don't have to try to find out what it was a metaphor for. What's a metaphor? Feeding cows. But here, I'll read exactly how you outlined it in your book. You said,
go for it.
It has become a standard practice to deny that the Bible's genealogies furnish a timeline of ancient events. This denial holds true even for most mainstream evangelical theologians. In fact, one way to distinguish between mainstream, quote, evangelicals and fundamentalist evangelicals is what they affirm about biblical chronology. I hadn't thought about it before, but that is a valid statement.
Kind of a litmus test.
It is a valid, it's a valid statement. The fundamentalists hold to the young earth and usually embrace the Usher chronology. Mainstream evangelicals avoid the question or claim that such allegiance is misplaced. They argue that the Bible's authors never, listen to this, folks. Yeah. They argue that, and this is true, they argue that the Bible's authors never intended that the Genesis genealogies were to be used to calculate how many years passed from the beginning of their lineage to its concluding entry. That statement is true, but when you say it out loud, it sounds to me so ludicrous because I tell you, because it makes it sound like the Father wasted his breath when the prophets calculate and give you the dates and the years. It's like, why did you waste your time if we weren't to know that?
We're going to talk about a guy named Green here in a little bit and how he does this. Wouldn't you love it to see a meeting between Green and Moses? And Green say to Moses, thank you for writing Genesis, but you and I agree, don't you, that you agree with me, don't you, that what you were saying about the age of the different patriarchs and how long between them and all that, that you didn't really mean history, did you?
It just, I mean, it sounds
metaphor. Wasn't that just, well, okay, Moses, maybe what it is that you're just mistaken because you live in a cultural setting in which you just misunderstand. Isn't that right, Moses?
It's just, the thing of it is those who will hold that view will not want to talk that clearly about this. Right. They will want to use other words to describe what they mean so that you forget what you just said about these facts.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It just, anyway, moving on. But it's so true. Right. It's so true. It suggested that the author intended something else by supplying dates for all the entries in the geology. What exactly that isn't really clear. Indeed, most authorities make a sweeping assertion that none of the Bible's genealogies yield a timeline at all. Which is just ludicrous in my opinion. And I don't mean that those people are ludicrous because they're very intelligent people.
Correct.
Right? You can have very intelligent people believe wrong information. Okay.
Sure.
That's not
maybe for good reasons, but wrong. There's still wrong reasons.
Yeah, I have to say that because somebody's going to misquote me and comment on it, and I'm going to have to address it next week.
Yeah.
Send your emails to Doug Woodward at faithhappens.com. You can go there and send your frustration emails there.
You really can, by the way, Doug at faith-happens.com. And I'll do my best to respond. And if I don't like what you say, then I'll just say, well, you're a troll. And I'll
exactly.
I'll send. So,
oh my goodness. Okay, so you got another chart here. I'm not sure I'm savvy enough to try to figure this out on the fly, but
next, can you move to figure 24?
That's what I'm looking for. As soon as I get
Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch. Let me explain. While you're trying to find that figure 24, I'm going to, percentage-wise, I don't think it helps you. I've actually, by the way, I want everyone to know, I have here in my hands my iPad, and I have a Kindle version that looks beautiful, and it's on.
Well, we can only see the dark parts of it, but
you can. Okay. Well, let me do this. What I want to show you is that
I'm trying to rotate this document because but it's not letting me do it because this one is sideways.
Can you see this now, Chad?
Yes, much better.
Cover on the iPad. What I'm telling you is that a Kindle version is now available for the book, and it's available for $9.99. And there are 2 or 3 nice features about the Kindle version, which I'll mention to you. One is it has color pictures. 2 is it has a nice index of all the tables and subtopics, so you can hit a button and jump to that spot. And then 3 is it has a great index, so you can, like what we're trying to do now is find a figure. If you had the Kindle version, you could press figure 24 and it would write to figure 24. And then lastly is there's about 400 footnotes in the book to substantiate and help validate what I've said to you in the book. And it also has those linked. You can go back and forth. So between the footnote and the actual text in the book.
Okay.
So, all right. So I want to make sure everybody knows that because the paperback is quite a bit more expensive. The paperback, of course, has a great index in it, but it doesn't have some of the features. It has black and white pictures, doesn't have color pictures and things like that. And it's also about $13 more expensive. So
you wanted figure 24?
Yeah, figure 24. And you're
all right. All right. There we go. Let's blow this up a little bit.
Page 196, according to that one.
Yeah. So let's blow this up so people can see.
Yeah. Now, what I want to point out, most people didn't know this. I didn't know this until I started researching this about a year ago. Is that the Samaritans, you might remember, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Samaritans lived north of Jerusalem. They were part of the sort of the nation of Benjamin, and they were northern Israel, but most of northern Israel had been hauled off by the Syrians and had been moved out of Israel, and others had been brought in to populate that area by the Syrians or the Assyrians. And the Samaritans, therefore, were a mixed race. There were some Israelites, then there were other types of races mixed into them, and they lived. And this was the group that you recall, the woman of the well, John chapter 4. She lived there, and she mentioned that that the Samaritans worship a temple and God at their temple, not in Jerusalem, right?
Mm-hmm.
But on Mount Gerizim. And so these were the Samaritans. Well, the Samaritans actually have a Pentateuch. Their Bible is just the first 5 books of the Bible. This Bible likely came to them as a result of the time when Nehemiah was squabbling with the then governor of Samaria, which was Sanballat, you may recall from the book of Nehemiah. And anyway, the Samaritans got ultimately kicked out, and they picked up their marbles, and they went home. And one of their marbles was a Pentateuch, and it's known as the Samaritan Pentateuch. Now, the Samaritan Pentateuch is therefore an ancient Hebrew Bible. It has been modified through the years to sort of make it fit better with the Samaritan religion, those areas that are different between the Jewish faith and the Samaritan faith. But nevertheless, what we find in their Pentateuch is that it matches quite well in many aspects with the Septuagint. So it helps to reaffirm the ages of many of the dates in the Septuagint. Again, being that this was a version of the Bible approximately 500 years before the Masoretic text. Now, there's quite a few changes in it that are not reflected in some other things, but nevertheless, there's still a strong point here is that this helps to indicate that much of the Septuagint chronology is accurate, at least as far as the Samaritan Pentateuch is concerned. Why is it different? Primarily because somewhere along the line, the Samaritan Pentateuch decided they wanted to match their Bible to the Book of Jubilees. The Book of Jubilees has dating that closely matches the Masoretic text. And so you might say there were some political reasons why they wanted to make some changes to the book, just as there were sort of political reasons why the rabbis wanted to change the Masoretic text. So long story short is that this is another source that helps to verify that the Septuagint was correct. But you'll see in detail, and I have down at the bottom, you should see some notes explaining why there are some differences and what those differences are and so forth. So I try to give you the details there.
Yeah, I want to point out too, I don't think you mentioned it. You do mention it in this portion of scripture, is that one of the things that lends well to this, there are a couple other alternate documents that point to the Septuagint, the LXX text being the most accurate even of these two. One of them, I can't remember the name of it.
You're jumping ahead.
Am I jumping ahead of you?
Yeah, you're jumping ahead. We're going to go look at Josephus.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
That's all right. You're in effect, you're thinking along the same lines I am. We're going to talk about Josephus, and we're going to talk about a Latin book that was written almost exactly at the same time that Jesus was teaching.
Okay. So go ahead and
so let's go look at there's I think it's the next figure. Go look at the next figure. I think it's figure 25, I believe.
Yeah, yep. I got to rotate this, so give me a second. My processor isn't that great. It's easier if I do it off screen here and then share.
Worries. I can use my Kindle version and jump right to that figure. So
yeah, there we go. Here we go. I think I got it.
Yeah, that's the one we want to look at. Now, this is the one that really tells the tale.
Ooh.
This is the one that really verifies that the Septuagint chronology has got it right.
Okay, so I'm trying to make this fit the best on the screen.
And by the way, for folks, when you get, if you decide to get the Kindle version, one thing you may remember is that when you know how you can rotate and the Kindle shifts or your phone shifts, one of the things you'll want to do is you'll want to go up into the corner where you have these little options. And one of those little options that has like the lock and the little circle around it is an option to where you can freeze or unfreeze the profile, whether you're in landscape or landscape mode or in portrait mode. And when you lock it, then you can look at these. Couple of these charts had to be laid out in landscape mode because they were much wider than they were tall. This is one of those. This is probably, other than the one that talks about the Exodus, this is probably the most important chart in the book. So you're going to want to study this one carefully. And so what this chart shows, let's go up a little higher where it shows the topics, which
yeah. I wanted to get kind of a scroll through there, so
show everybody what else.
Yeah, so they can see.
We're giving you the biblical reference. We're giving you who the patriarch is. We're showing you the standard Usher / King James / Masoretic dating for the begetting age and the remaining years. Notice, I should point out also, notice that if you look at the begetting age under the Masoretic text, for instance, Adam says 130, Septuagint says 230. Seth says 105 in the Masoretic and the Septuagint 205. So that's where most of these differences are. Anywhere where I've also got some gray, like in Methuselah's 167, 187, Lamech's 753. Down at the bottom, I'll give you a footnote that explains kind of why there's a little difference there. All right. But the main thing that this does, so first off, it shows you the contrast between Septuagint and Masoretic. Now, move over to the right. So stop where you still show the Septuagint. So if you show the Septuagint, Josephus, and this Latin book, Liber Antiquitatum Biblicanum, all right, what that is, now think about that. If it's a Latin book, who was using that book?
Let me see. Perhaps maybe the Romans.
Romans, yeah. Romans.
Is that a good
guess? That's right. So if you look at Josephus, now Josephus says that in his books, and you know this because you've read almost all of Josephus. I've read only portions of him. That Josephus talks about the fact that he translates the Hebrew directly into the Greek himself. All right. But someone else has translated the Greek, the Septuagint, into the Latin. Now, all of this was done, the Liber Antiquitatum Biblicanum, this was written about 100 years before Rabbi Akiba changed the Masoretic text. All right, Josephus is writing about 40 years before the text is changed, the Masoretic text. In fact, you'll see Josephus say two different things. Some of his books show these dates, and another of his books, his last book, shows that he switched over to the Jewish dating system, possibly because of political pressure.
Well, I have a theory about that too. I believe that his work was changed by whoever was doing the translation for Rome.
Very good. Well, or for other Jews.
For other Jews. That's what I believe happened, because I think he didn't change it. I think it was changed for him.
All right. So now, if you one of the comments I make, and I talk about all the different church fathers and how those church fathers confirm the Septuagint dates, almost all of them, to be the accurate dates. But if you look at all of these sources, what you're seeing, these are sources that were written 50 years, 100 years, almost 400 years before Akiba and his team at Javne or Jamnia began to alter the Masoretic text. So
I want you guys
you make the point.
Hear that point, guys. This is before the Masoretic. These versions with these datings. No, we're not even talking about the LXX here. So just ignore that left column for a second.
Yeah.
These versions, the Josephus and this LAB, which is as commonly referred to, if you're ever reading documented sources or source notes, you see LXX, and then sometimes you've seen that LAB, you had no idea what that is. That's this Liber Antiquitatum Biblicanum. Biblicum,
known
the
as
Latin.
in English we call it biblical antiquities.
Right, Bible. Yeah, it's just LAB. That's how it's connotated. So these books, 70 and 40 years before Akiba's versions came out, the Masoretic text, the MS, had these chronologies, had these dates. So what? I mean,
Yeah,
you can just ask yourself that question.
Right.
What do you think happened?
Right. The evidence is clear, right?
I mean, it doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't take a brain surgeon to figure out exactly what took place here. Right. Especially when you start trying to figure out motive. That's always what you're going to try. That's what any court does, is trying to obtain and ascertain the motive. What motive could they have? And you can understand and ascertain that there are many people who had a lot of motive to make changes into why they would want, what that motive points to.
Right, exactly.
I have a hard time disagreeing with you, Doug, throughout this book, which is, which is why I'm enjoying it so much, I guess.
I should have been a lawyer, because I like to, I create these arguments, that this logically had to be the way it is, because, if you look at the time of this,
Well, until I get more information, Doug, of course.
Well, of course. I mean, I'll make mistakes. But,
until other information surfaces.
It's almost if you understand that the chronologies were changed, you say, okay, well, there had to be a reason to change them. Well, obviously there was. And if we understand why it was, well, because they expected the Messiah, to come at exactly the time that Jesus came. Mm-hmm. Well, why would they change it then? Well, because they didn't want Jesus to be the Messiah.
Exactly. Right? And they had good reason not to, because just as when the Messiah was there, I mean, it subverted and did away with all their authority, all their power, or their ability to rule, their legitimacy. Their entire legitimacy was pulled out from under them. They had no power, if it was true, which is, of course, the case.
We understand that today because we talk about the elites, we talk about us, and then there's
absolutely.
Guess who the elites were? From a scholarship standpoint, it was the rabbis. Guess who the common men were? That was the apostles. And so you had two Jewish, in effect, sects going forward. You had the elites,
you had
the common man.
You had the alternate, what would be called the alternate media, which would be the apostles and the scriptures. Right. And then you had mainstream media, which was the rabbis.
There you go. You had the alternate media and the mainstream media. And
fake news.
and it kind of boils down to that simple kind of understanding of motivation, right?
Right. So they were the CNN.
Once you understand they changed these chronologies, then it becomes a lot easier to believe they also changed the messianic prophecies.
Yeah, so, yeah, absolutely. And it makes perfect sense. Folks, I'm encouraging you to just get the book. It's now out on Kindle. So this variance, talk about this final point here in with the years in the datings, this final dating, because you pointed out in your book, and I took down the view here real quick, but I'll put it back up here.
Yeah, go ahead.
About the finalized dating, because that's a very interesting number that is arrived at here.
So in other words, if you look at these dates and then or you're thinking in terms of what does that tell us about when Adam was actually created and so forth?
Yeah.
So in fact, if you jump to, let me have you jump to it's sort of the last summary of the summary chart in the book before you go into the appendices. By the way, this is a book in which you really want to read the appendices.
Yeah, I can just tell everybody for sure. We were talking before the show last week, and Doug asked me, so how far have you read? And I said, well, I've gotten through chapter 3 or 4. It's because you do want to do that. I'm going back and looking at his references, and there's so much detail in the references alone to back up what Doug is boiling down for you in his book. But you will want to read those to understand why Doug is drawing the conclusions that he has and saying what he's saying, because just like many of these people, they they use about 5 pages to say what could have been said in a couple sentences. They're not, and that's just typical of writing in those days.
Right.
When it comes to the sources, that's the detail that they offered. But you have to read into it. They don't come. What I'm saying is they don't come right out and say it. They don't come right out and say these things, but it's there. It's you. You have to read it for yourself, and you say, "Oh yeah, what Doug said."
Yeah. Well, keep in mind that why am I writing in the way that I'm writing? I'm trying to prove that this is actually history.
Yeah. No, and I agree. I just breaking down for people, exactly why you want to read that.
Yeah. Well, and there's just a lot of substance in the back. In fact, I was telling you that Appendix 5. I think I was telling you that, the preservation of the text. If you study, how do we know that God's preserved the text, or that God is preserving the text for us? One of the main points I want you to walk away from the book with is the Septuagint is one of the strongest tools that we have that shows us or gives us a way to find out what the original text was. Right?
Amen.
All right. And so if you want to know what the Bible really said, the best way to find that out, surprisingly, is looking at the Greek version, because it was written so close to the original Hebrew version. All right. And so
and
why the Septuagint is so important.
And again, to point out, you say, well, why do you have to read the Greek? Why can't you just read the Hebrew? Because the existing vorlags used to create the Septuagint no longer exist, as far as we know.
That's
or can prove.
There's bits and pieces that may be in the Dead Sea Scrolls,
right? But there's no way you have only one point of reference. There's no witness. There's no signatures to say this is definitely of that vorlog that was used to create it. So it's unknown. It's unprovable. So it can't be used as a witness.
I should make one other point here. How are we on time, by the way?
We've got, well, it's up to you. We've only got 6 minutes left in tonight's show, but we can go whatever you feel comfortable with.
You can talk a little bit more. All right. So the point I wanted to make is that in terms of the textual evidence, we should point out that the Masoretic text, the most recent copy of a full, in effect, what's called a codice, or a kind of a complete book of the Bible, there is one that's in Hebrew, known as the Leningrad Codex. It's the Masoretic text, and it's dated to 1008 AD. All right, so we have one copy. When it comes to the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, we have 3 codices, and they all come from the 3rd and 4th century. So they predate the one version of the Hebrew Masoretic text by almost 600 to 700 years. So it's another way of saying, okay, we're able to, it's like getting in a time machine and moving all the way back. And we know that whole period, there was time where errors could have crept in, but because we've got not one but 3 copies of the full codice, we have 6,000 copies of bits and pieces. We have 3 virtually full Bibles from the 3rd and 4th century in the Greek that are the Septuagint. All right, so it's another strong argument why the evidence for the Septuagint is stronger than the evidence for the Masoretic text. So just thought I'd throw that in as a bonus.
No, I agree. And if you maybe some folks are familiar with another person, Chris Pinto, who has a view out there. He did a series a year ago, or maybe even 2 years ago now, where he talks about some of the histories. But this is a very important key to listen here. And I mentioned in the first program, called modern textual criticism. It's a term that you will hear used in the Bible colleges today.
Right. If you go to seminary, you're going to get
if you go to seminary, that's the terminology or the terms that you're going to use. Modern textual criticisms, because we have better science, we can now understand, in more scripts, we can now understand better. And just because something's older doesn't mean it's necessarily truth. that is not what we're saying here, because I don't want people to be confused who have listened to Chris Pinto sound like we're saying the opposite of what Chris Pinto has said, because that's not what we're said. We're not saying older, just because something is older, it's necessarily better. What we're saying is the compilation of evidence is better. The compilation, there's the text, the number of texts are better. You can prove what was being used by the believing church of Yeshua's day. You can prove that without a question.
Well, it's a little bit, to make it simple, it's kind of like if you have one evidence of a murder, of a shooting, from one person, and then you've got on one hand, and they say it a certain way, and then you got three that are all saw it from different points in time. They don't know each other. They hadn't talked before, but they were brought in by the police, and they gave their statements, and their point of view is different than this one person, but yet all three of those agree. Which one is the policeman likely to believe?
Exactly.
He's going to believe the three.
Right.
So it's a way of looking at the evidence. And so I was going to have you go to figure 53.
Okay, it's going to take me a second, but I will find it.
Right at the back, it's right before the appendices begin.
Okay, well, I'm scrolling real fast here.
What I'll tell folks as you're doing that is that this is the sort of the final chronology chart, and I'll just kind of hold it up. They won't be able to see it too well, but you can kind of see that. That's what that is right there. All right, and that this chart is going to show you going from Jacob all the way back to Adam, precisely how long each of them lived, when were they born, when did they die. It's going to show you, the argument that I have is that the dates here say that the creation account, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, suggests that the date of the creation of Adam and Eve was 5616 BC. 5616 BC, not 4004 BC. So the difference of 1612 years. And that the flood was not 2348 BC, but it was 3359 BC. You can see that gray bar in the middle. All right. And that Abraham was, if you go down there, you can see Abraham was born in 2128 BC. And he, and then let's see, let's not look at the lifespan if that's what I'm looking at. Yeah, I'm trying to understand. Yeah, that's right. Those are just the dates. BC, when he was born in 2128, he died in 1953. That's correct. But I was going to make a point, though, as you'll see as we go into the Exodus study, is that Abraham was born exactly 500 years before the Exodus, which is interesting. I had not seen anybody else be able to calculate that.
Well, I think Krieger calculated 490 years, 490 years, about 490. So he's close. He's
close. Now Krieger argues that
it's 1,000-year difference. Of course, he's going with Usher's. But as far as
argues that the Exodus was 1440 BC,
right?
And the conquest of Canaan was basically 1400 BC.
Right. I'm not. Yeah, and I just to be clear, I'm not talking about the dating of the years. I'm talking about the variance of time between what happens, not necessarily. Yeah, so 500 years variance, 490 years variance, even though the years are about 1,000 years difference.
Yes, when Abraham was born versus when the Exodus occurred.
Correct.
Yeah, and of course he's showing that in part because of the 70s.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
And Doug's done some wonderful work, and of course he's written a fabulous review. Basically said that I've given him a bunch of itching powder, and it's causing him to have to scratch his brain quite a bit.
Yep.
Because we disagree, but and I told him when he gets back from his African junket,
right,
that we need to sit down and really go through this all in detail.
Just so that people know, Doug Krieger is going to teach really in South Africa at a stadium. Listen to this teaching hall. He showed me a picture of it. A teaching hall that sits like 20 to 60. Is it, what did he say? Almost 60,000 people. Yeah, 20, like some 20,000 people, but it's not a stadium. It's a hall. It's like a hall that goes straight back. Open air with a ceiling over the entire thing. There's a roof over in the entire thing that'll seat 20,000 people. The restrooms are at the back.
But, and you hope you can make it in time. Right?
Anyway, so these datings, these datings here. So you got the patriarch, the son, the begetting age, son's birth AC, son's birth BC, the lifespan of years, and the lifespan dates.
In terms of the dates.
And these are the chronology from Adam to Joseph, according to the Septuagint.
Yeah. That's right. And again, these dates are using from Adam to Abraham, and then what it's also then based on are the dates that I've been able to cobble together through the research with quite a few sources for, again, these two very fuzzy periods, the period of the Judges and the period of the Israelite kings. All right. So those are the two that are hard. And then of course I go into those to show that in detail in the next two chapters.
The thing that immediately jumps out to me here regarding your dating is, I don't know if you saw this or not, this flood at 2257 years. That's so very close to the sacred cubit number of 22.5 or 2250.
Yes, it's actually I'm contradicting you, but because it's 25.20. So,
right.
But that's okay. But now to jump about
2520, right. Yeah.
There are a couple main points to make here. One is that the point I'm arguing that really is the focal point for part 2 of the book that it's not in this book, it's in the one that I hope to have done in about 9 to 10 months, is that there's more time now. There's 2,300 years between the time of the flood and Adam instead of about 1,600 years. So there's more time in the antediluvian world for the Nephilim to have done their thing, right? And for a lot more of the events that we think maybe happened earlier, it looks in terms of secular archaeology, that may have happened in that window of time. And then you've also got an additional 1,000 years from the time of Noah until the time of Abraham, from what you've got, I should say is 1,000 years difference from the time of the flood in the Septuagint, from the time of the flood in the Masoretic. And so that means that there's a lot less compression of events. So you can then see how, okay, let's assume this 3359 is true. Egypt's dynasties begin in secular archaeology around 3000 BC. Now, there's an adjustment that I talk about and go into detail, suggesting that they really probably occurred. They started about 2700 BC. That means that there was roughly 600 years from the flood until really the first dynasty of Egypt. Likewise, in looking at the Mesopotamian archaeology, the Mesopotamian archaeology says that the cities of Mesopotamia began to be built around 3100 BC. Now, if you have the Usher chronology of 2300 for the flood, you really can't really reconcile those things.
Right. And that's the problem that Mahoney ran into.
Yes. Well, that's one of them. That's one of them. Right. That's right. So what this shows, the other problem you've got certain problems regarding the timing of the flood versus the timing of the Tower of Babel.
Right.
And do you have enough time for the population to grow, to be big enough, to have had a chance to create a Tower of Babel? And if you don't have that much time, if you only have 120 years, which is kind of what you have in the Masoretic text or the King James Version, you really don't have enough time for there to be a whole lot of people to build a Tower of Babel. So you've got all those kinds of issues that are compressed. But if you open that time up, and all of a sudden you've got 250 years from the flood before the Tower of Babel, or likewise, you've got 700 more years in the antediluvian world than the things that we may see at Baalbek or some of these other very strange things that we've seen in ancient archaeology, like maybe even Göbekli Tepe and some other things, that may have happened in that window of time, because it's a much longer window of time than what you can have in the Ussher view. So one of the things that I'm hoping to do, and I'm going to get a lot of pushback from the young earth creationists, but I'm going to try to say to them, look, if you accept the Septuagint dates, you're going to have an easier time making the case for the young earth point of view, because you can better reconcile archaeology with the Bible than you can with a Bible that uses the King James Version's dates. And they may say, well, I don't care. Like Ken Ham says, it's all a matter of, the authority of the Word of God, which is just so wrong. It's just so wrong.
You better say that again, because somebody just heard you wrong.
Yeah. Well, I'll say that Ken Ham will argue that believing in the young earth dating is a question of the authority of the Bible. He's going to say that's what the Bible tells you. The Bible tells you the earth was created in 4004 BC. And I want to tell Ken Ham, wrong Ken Ham, the true Bible tells you it was created in 5616 BC. That's what the Bible really said.
Thank you for saying it differently that time, because somebody was already typing out a comment and blowing up in their brain.
That I'm shooting at Ken Ham. Yeah.
Right. Well, they heard you say Ken Ham is wrong, and they didn't hear anything else that you
after
said.
That, I totally agree. Ken Ham is not wrong about everything, but he does tend to want to believe that his interpretation is the only interpretation, right?
Yeah.
And that his interpretation is what is authoritative.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's not the case. The Bible's truth is what's authoritative. And then we have to, as students of the Bible, try to understand what the Bible really teaches.
This is why, and again, this is a conversation you and I had off screen, and my viewers, those people who know me will know this. I really don't like it when somebody wants to put me in association with this group or that group.
Oh yeah.
Or this thing, because then when that group is associated with a theology or a thought or a teaching, then I'm naturally lumped in with those people.
Sure.
The truth of the matter, the fact is the minute I find out somebody wants to do that, I maybe this is the rebel in me. I want to immediately set out to do something to rile their feathers and say I'm a part of a different group. Or you know what I'm saying?
I was accused of being a replacement theologian.
Well, my relationship.
Boy, am I not a replacement theologian?
Yeah, my relationship is with people. I have friends, good friends, who disagree strongly with each other.
Sure.
But I don't love them any less, and so it doesn't mean I agree with everything they have to say, but I acknowledge the fact that they have acknowledged the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. They've been baptized. They call upon the Father. They claim to be His child. The core of their teaching is that. Anything else is something we can discuss. I've said that many times on this show. Doug Woodward, we've been trying to win him over to the Commonwealth theology now for a while. I'm still working on him. Doug, do you have a copy of that book? Did Krieger ever send you one?
I don't know if I've seen the final.
I got a copy. I'll send it over to you. We're still working on him on that, so there's room for discussion.
Sure.
But I've seen in the 10 years, Doug Woodward, I've seen your stance on things change. Maybe people who didn't follow you as closely.
Sure.
I can mention one clearly. When you wrote the Final Babylon with Krieger and his
Dean.
name Dean would your view has slightly changed on that, and you've said that from Babylon to Daughter of Babylon. we've got to be willing to be wrong on the things that are not essential to the faith. What you and I do, and which is why I have a kindred spirit with you, which is why we both have mutual friends in Dr. Spalding and Dr. Lake, is because we want to know what the truth is. And the minute you can prevent it with evidence, you got to go with that until something else proves.
You got to keep studying. You can't keep that once you've, like, I've written this book. Guess what? I'm still reading books on the Septuagint.
I'm doing this. Yeah,
it's not like I'm done with it. I got to keep studying.
I'm doing a second edition of my book because there's more material that needs to be added, folks. We've got to hold on to these things when it comes to these things. You can hold on with a grip, but don't make it so tight it breaks off your hand when you're presented with something that conflicts with it. Right?
No, that's absolutely true. Let me make a point, and it'll be a segue, and then probably we should finish because we've given folks an awful lot to think about.
Sure.
The second half of chapter 5 is going to deal with the question of whether or not the Bible intends for the Genesis chronologies to be real history or not. And in evangelical theology, beginning in 1890, a guy named William H. Green wrote a book, or rather had a very long paper on the issue of whether or not Genesis was teaching history or whether it was just kind of painting with a broad brushstroke what was going on. Should we believe, in other words, those years or not? Should we believe that maybe there really were gaps? Maybe there's sort of like, there's like 3 or 4 generations between each of the patriarchs, but it's not one patriarch to the next, to the next, to the next, that there's a big gap between. And so, and I go into that and talk about that because that is probably the seminal point of differentiation between, I would say, where we are, Chad, which is we believe in Genesis as history,
literal
chronology as history, versus the more progressive evangelicals, which I think Dr. Heiser, who I love and I think he's awesome, I believe he would argue that the chronologies of Genesis 5 and 11 are not necessarily historically accurate.
Yeah,
that there could be gaps between those generations.
Right. I
feel okay.
Yeah, and when it comes, to speak that, there's a couple things. I love a number of Dr. Heiser's works. They're brilliant. The information, absolutely. But I differ with him in that, and I think he's leans more towards the preterist type viewpoint. He believes more in a localized flood, which I disagree with. I disagree with both of those points, but I don't. But the other things, his seminal work with the 70 nations, the unseen realm, absolute brilliant stuff. It adds a lot of information to things that make us understand and make sense. But I disagree with him on those points.
So anyway,
and that's okay.
The second part of the chapter gets pretty technically into some of the Hebrew and so forth to explain the argument for why the chronologies of Genesis 5 and 11 are history and they are complete. There aren't missing gaps, missing generations, right? And so, again, it helps to shore up the argument for why, when we say the date is 5616, why it really is 5616 and not 10,000 BC, right?
Yes. Well, let me ask you this, Doug. We'll just do this live, and you can tell me. Do you want to come back for a part 4 and kind of give your final thoughts on the book? Do you think this is okay? We'll do one more. We'll do one more piece, perhaps, and you can maybe skip more towards the end because this is chapter 5, but there's not a lot of chapters in this book. There's a lot of information in these chapters.
Right. Yeah. Each chapter is about 40 to 45 pages. So
Yeah, they're pretty lengthy. So we're about halfway through the book with chapter 5. So maybe next week, part 4, you can give a little bit of towards the end of the book.
Probably jump into the Exodus,
Yeah,
and the timing and some of these issues we were talking about with Tim Mahoney. For those people that haven't seen Patterns of Evidence, Tim Mahoney, strongly encourage you to watch that.
That's your homework.
That's your homework assignment. And then again, the Kindle version is available now. It's only $9.99. I encourage people to get it, to read it, and I think you will feel like that it's a good investment. So anyway, so I want to make sure everyone knows it's available now.
All right, that sounds great. Well, this has been Disputed Lands. I'm going to try once again next week or the next time with my intro and my outro. I'll talk to some smart people, and we'll get that figured out. Thanks for joining us. This is my friend Doug Woodward. We've been talking about his book, Rebooting the Bible. Go to faithhappens.com. Find Rebooting the Bible there. You can get it directly from him, probably an autographed copy, or you can buy it on Amazon and a Kindle download version, probably free for the Kindle Unlimited, I'm guessing, like it is.
People that are on Kindle Unlimited, you can get the book free.
Yeah. So go there, get that, and so we'll see you the next time. Thanks for watching.
Bye-bye.